Hello, I'm Glenn Ahrens. I'm your Oregon State University Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties. I've been a forester for almost 40 years, starting with a bachelor's in forestry from Humboldt State University. I got a master's in forest science from Oregon State University. And then my careers included research and private forest consulting and extension for the last 20 years, just wanting to help people use my knowledge to help them succeed in understanding and managing forests. For this program, I'm going to focus on woodlands and forests for small acres landowners, rural folks, and even closer to town if you've got trees and forests that you're learning to manage. A key starting point for me is to work with you to consider your goals and objectives. It's hard for a forester to help anyone without a good foundation in understanding, your outlook and your goals and objectives for your land. And then I'm going to highlight important things to know about woodland management in this fairly brief presentation, some of the things that really stand out to me that I want to share. Ultimately, just want to be able to help you learn about successful practices, connect you with learning opportunities and sources of assistance. And in terms of the Q&A, normally I like to do that as we go in person, but in this case, I'd like you to save your questions and note them as they come up. You can pause this presentation and maybe write them down so that when we meet online on February 16th for this program, be able to answer your questions and share and discuss. And of course, beyond that, you'll be able to contact me in the future. It's a pretty long-term learning process in forestry. My role as the extension forester is to help people learn how to sustain benefits of trees and forests. Particularly if you look at Oregon and where our family forest ownerships are located, your lands have a really significant role, not only in meeting your own objectives and personal enjoyment, but also providing those benefits near where people live. If you look at the Willamette Valley area here, and say in Marion County, you can see that these kind of pink to purple colored family forests are most abundant where people live, near where people live. You have to go further up the mountain and into the woods before you get into larger ownerships of either private or state or national forest. So you own and manage the forests that are most abundant where people live and provide benefits for society as well as yourselves. In terms of important things to know about your forests, obviously knowing your trees, learning to know the native trees of Oregon and of your land. And I want to be able to help you with that. We have a variety of resources, reading materials both online and in print, such as the Trees to Know in Oregon publication here, and also an online version of the Common Trees of the Pacific Northwest. My favorite publications and very useful and easy to read illustrated publication is this Establishing and Managing Forest Trees in Western Oregon. And so I refer you to that, and it's available online, and also you can get a nice print copy free from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. And as an example, a page out of that book really reviewing the basic characteristics of our primary forest trees in Oregon, looking at native tree species in the Willamette Valley. This gives you an idea of their preferences and also their tolerances for various environmental conditions. You can start looking at the growth rate. What's the faster growing trees under good conditions? Douglas fir, 3 to 4 feet of height a year. Some of our slower growing trees, such as incense cedar, 1 to 2 feet. Oregon white oak really starts pretty slow. And look at black cottonwood, which can grow as much as 10 or 12 feet in a year. And then if you look at the tolerances, one of the key things that foresters look at is the tolerance to shade or low light levels. Our Douglas fir is relatively intolerant. 1 means it's not tolerant or very susceptible to a feature, and a 5 means it's very tolerant or not susceptible to a feature here. So for example, the most tolerant of shade would be our western red cedar and our western hemlock, and down in the hardwoods, big leaf maple. And then the least tolerant of shade, would be ponderosa pine, our white oak, alders, and cottonwood. Another key thing, of course, tolerance to drought and or wet soil on the other hand. So if you're trying to match a species for the land that you manage, it's really important to know the characteristics of the species as well as your land in terms of some of the key features. You know, the most drought tolerant trees that we have are pine and oak and madrone. And the least drought tolerant are western red cedar and hemlock and alders and cottonwood. So part of getting to know your land, of course, is the land itself, and then the kind of environment that characterizes it. Understanding climate, the variability of climate, and particularly the extremes, is very important and increasingly so. And that kind of depends on your topography, your elevation, what direction the slope faces, if there's a slope, how steep are the slopes. And then soils are extremely important, and I'll talk more about that because that's really the basis for plant growth is in addition to the above ground resources of light, there's the soil. And of course, related to that is, the moisture supply to the trees, to the tree roots. We look at the average summer rain, and it's really not the average so much. I mean, certainly that matters, but the extremes in terms of the driest summers, because the trees have to survive over their long lives, the ups and downs or the extremes. And so if you look at this, just looking at across my territory, Estacada as kind of the wetter area going up into the Cascades, and in a very dry summer, July through September, there may be still, a couple inches of rain, and then many times, there'll be 6 or 7 inches of rain in Estacada. But if you look at drier places like Salem and the Willamette Valley, you can see there's many years where there's less than 1 inch of rain over the 3 months of July through September. If you think about what trees need to live and grow well, if they're well watered, trees can use 10 to 20 inches of rain over the summertime if they had all the water they could use. And so if they're limited to only 1 inch of water, obviously they're going to be pretty well shut down from normal growth. Then if you think about, well, how do the trees survive when we have 60 to 80 days without rain and some of those dry summers? And the answer is that if they have a good soil that holds a lot of available moisture, then they're able to draw the soil moisture reserves for weeks and months even. And so then, of course, that makes your soil type a critical thing for you to know and understand as it may change across your land. For example, I've shown just one of our common forest soils, the Jory soil, Oregon State soil. It can hold up to 10 inches or more of available water, which is enough to sustain a tree for a couple of months in many cases. But if you happen to have some of the other soils, such as the examples here, all kind of within one area in the Willamette Valley foothills, you could have this Rittner-Cobley loam, which only holds about 4 inches of available water, or some of the poorly drained sites that are actually limited by too much water in the winter, but they don't have much water in the summer, only 3 inches. So those trees would be really restricted from growing for many months during the summer, 2 months if there's no rain. So that can make a huge difference, and it can vary a short distance across your land. And now when you put things together and want to get to know your forest as a whole, the types of forest you have, of course that's going to vary a lot depending on all these factors I discussed about soils and topography and all that. But also, of course, what's happened in the forest, how old is it, what species happen to be growing there. For example, in this fairly mature Douglas fir forest type, about 80 years old, with a mix of cedar and maple and other species and a fairly lush understory. And we've thinned this one a few times, so that is a very distinct type of forest. And this happens to be from a landscape that I work with at our Hopkins demonstration forest up near Molalla. Another part of that forest up on the dry rocky ridgetop, we have madrone, which is evidence of a drier environment that used to burn more often, mixed with Douglas fir and poison oak, pretty much going together, madrone and poison oak. Lower down the hill, there's a patch that's about 25 years old with Doug fir that was planted, and it's growing in a somewhat of a tough soil with a kind of salal understory, which indicates a drier kind of environment. Just a few hundred feet away, there's a different type of slope with a different soil in this 40-year-old patch of trees with a fairly mesic or moist understory with sword fern, indicating a different condition. And then a real wet spot here down the hill from there with devil's club and ferns and cedar and maple and alder predominating. All different forest types here across this Hopkins forest. And if you look at a map of the forest, this is really an important thing for you to get for your land, is to really get a good aerial photo and the maps of topography and soil conditions and other features that are important to you. In terms of the forest types, though, we ultimately like to get a delineation and be able to understand the different patches of trees that I just showed you kind of a sample of. So for instance, here's the patch of 40-year-old Douglas fir that was planted. Down here is an area that we're managing selectively with trees up to 100 years old. We have a new regeneration area here that was harvested 5 years ago. So you get to know and map and get the acreage and other aspects of what's in those different types of forests. And of course, you're learning that in this course, and there's many resources available to help you get these maps and come up with these vegetation or forest types. Another key aspect of knowing your forest is thinking of it in terms of the historical fire type. All of our forests in the valley margin in most of Oregon are driven by fire, and the oak woodlands of the valley used to be maintained by fairly frequent low surface fires for the majority of those, and those might happen as often as every few years, or on average maybe 12 years. If you get into the Douglas fir forests that were native to the valley foothills, many of those forests were also maintained by fairly frequent and low severity fires, so it didn't kill trees. It kind of maintained a more open understory, would kill smaller trees but not bigger trees, but occasionally then would go a longer period without burning, and the fuels accumulate, and that would burn more severely and kill all the trees, and we call that a stand replacement kind of fire regime. And then when you get higher up into the mountains or more moist areas, or Douglas fir hemlock types, those are more characteristic of higher severity fires. They don't burn very often, the fuels accumulate, but when it is dry enough to burn and that wind blows, as we've unfortunately seen more lately, it can go for 100 to 300 years without fire, but then burn more catastrophically. And the wettest forests in Oregon may not burn for 1,000 years in some of our wet coastal areas. So understanding that kind of where do you live in terms of the fire regime has a lot to do with kind of why you have the kind of forest you have and what you might expect in terms of fuels accumulation and fire. Of course, a really important part of getting to know your forest are understanding the forest health problems and threats. We usually, or many of us, think about a disease or an insect as being a primary problem or a cause of trees dying or not doing well. And we call those biotic agents. Of course, animals and humans are also biotic agents that can cause tree health problems with direct damage to trees or by eating them. But the abiotic agents often play a really big role. So the drought, the heat, the extremes in climate, flood, and wind. And of course, oftentimes these interact and make trees more susceptible to disease or insect. And so, common question for me as the extension forester, I'm often just asked, what's wrong with my trees, or is my forest healthy? And of course, what can we do to keep them healthy? And here is an example of Douglas fir flare out, we call this, when the trees suddenly, parts of them die and they turn kind of bright reddish and brown. And what's going on there? And in this case, the primary issue is drought stress in some of these valley sites with hot, dry summers. And there's a stem canker fungus that is pretty much everywhere, but it really doesn't show itself until trees get stressed, and then it can grow on the main stem and cause this kind of girdling and kill the tops. So oftentimes what is killing or threatening your tree is an interaction of these biotic and abiotic factors. It's not just one thing. Another example is red alder really had a lot of trouble over the last 10 years with drier, warmer summer conditions where the tops die and they get a stem canker disease that's causing that, similar to what we saw in the Douglas fir. And young stands of trees, when they reach this, a really dense, crowded state, they often have a lot of competition stress. The hardest thing on a Douglas fir tree or other species can be their neighbor being too close and one outcompeting the other. And then you add drought to that, and then sometimes insects move in and attack drought-stressed trees. And one fairly famous, infamous insect is the flathead fir borer, shown here, that particularly attacks drought-stressed Douglas fir, more commonly in southern Oregon, but we do see it showing up here off and on in northwest Oregon. And then a really common combination when you see patches of Douglas fir, in this case, dying, is that root diseases are fairly common, and you may not even know that they're there until you have a series of drought years, because the trees have been doing well in spite of disease kind of working on the roots. But during drought, then that really becomes too much. And then bark beetles find those trees and they move in, and this combination will cause sudden mortality of Douglas fir. And of course, we learn to identify these, and there are some steps we can take to mitigate this or prevent some of these things. I can't go into much detail here, but that's something that you can learn from me and others, and get help to assess this or diagnose it. Douglas fir beetle, for example, has a really classic attack pattern, and the pattern of the beetles chewing under the bark by the thousands is what kills the tree, and it leaves a distinctive track under the bark that you can identify as a Douglas fir beetle distinct from other bark beetles. I mentioned root rot. The most common one in northwest Oregon is the laminated root disease, and it's thought to occur on as much as over 10% of the ground in northwest Oregon. And that was one of the primary factors, with drought and root rot interacting and attracting the bark beetles. And we definitely have an understanding of this disease and how we identify where it is and how we manage for it, primarily by clearing out trees that are infected and go beyond the last one and plant trees that are not susceptible over time. We're seeing a little bit more mysterious dieback of other species, and western red cedar in particular, that's rather concerning, seeing mature trees, large trees dying fairly rapidly. And we are not finding any disease or insect agents causing this. It does appear to be more of a climate and soils interaction. So when you look at, how do we keep our trees and forests healthy? There's a list of recommendations, of course. Prevention, do no harm, don't beat up your trees, don't drive machinery or compact soils. Assessing your soils and climate conditions and hazards, and keep an eye on that, and favoring species that are going to be well adapted. Maintaining the vigor of your trees, often just by making sure they have enough growing space, which may involve thinning or planting the right number, and just keeping an eye on things. And when you do have issues, learn how to manage them, remove and sanitize unhealthy trees, plant species that are going to be more resistant to whatever the cause might be. Don't attract or introduce pests such as bark beetles by leaving a lot of down debris. In some cases, that can be a problem. And of course, there are specific treatments that may help that we can prescribe. Of course, a key factor that I've been talking about that comes into this is climate and climate stress. And just as an example on this map, if you look at our part of the world here in Western Oregon, and you see the brown color, well, that's indicating in the year 2018, that summer, from June through August, we were down to 20 to 30% of average precipitation, rainfall that we might expect during that time. Of course, that's pretty severe, but if you look at California, which is in the red, that's 0. So we're a little better off than they were that summer, but that was one of our hot, dry summers, certainly. And a good tool I find, especially now trying to look back and see what kind of recurrence of drought and heat and just how bad has it been now or compared to the past. There's a great tool. The PRISM Climate Group at Oregon State University developed some good tools where you can just click on your area and get all kinds of good data about past climate all the way up to the present, but going often back over 100 years. And I found that particularly useful when I moved over from the coast to be your extension forester here in the valley about 10 years ago. But I started getting all these questions about why are the trees dying, and is this drought and this summer any worse than they've seen before? And I use some of these climate um, tools to look at one of the key features, which is not just the heat or the drought, but it's the how hot is it and how dry is the air. And so the drier humidity, it's been slightly lower humidity, it reveals that the demand for moisture uh, over the last 5 to 10 years has exceeded even any maximum you can see going back 50 years. So indeed, our trees have been seeing some conditions that they haven't seen in a long time, and it helps explain why some of them are showing dieback or symptoms of drought and heat stress. 2015, 2017, 2018, and then 2021 were some of the most extreme years in terms of both hot and dry conditions in the Willamette Valley for over 50 years. Of course, that brings up the question, is this climate change? I mean, it's certainly, hotter and drier than it's been for a long time. I didn't go back too far in time, but if indeed, the projections are saying that this kind of thing will continue, perhaps more often than in the past, and warming temperatures have a lot of consequences, such as longer fire seasons, increased frequency of fire, uh, you know, increases opportunity for invasive species with these disturbances, such as fire, shifting species composition as the plants kind of rearrange themselves, adapting to the new climates. And then, of course, it's harder to establish trees with hot, dry summers, such as the terrible year we just had in 2021. Um, Drought stress, as we saw, interacting with diseases, reducing productivity. So these are all things that we're kind of keeping an eye on and thinking about how do we manage our forests to help mitigate some of this or adapt to this in the future. And one of the key parts of that is we're basically talking about managing for more heat and drought in the future, just as what we experienced that we hadn't seen for a long time. And if it keeps happening like this periodically, one main thing we can do is really look harder at favoring those heat and drought tolerant species, even amongst the native species. Going back to that list of the chart that showed the tolerances of the different species, and that also then translates to managing for a warmer, drier type of forest. And so, for example, a Douglas fir hemlock forest is a more moist type of Douglas fir forest. You'd see that dominating more, again with less fire as well, usually a little higher up in the mountains. And we can move it towards a drier Douglas fir type without the hemlock, which is more intolerant of drought, and also just wider spaced trees and more frequent, thinning and fields reduction. In the case of a Douglas fir grand fir type, which is pretty common in the valley margin, we would back off to a drier type that would have more pine, incense, cedar with Douglas fir. Douglas fir itself is fairly drought and heat tolerant, but we're seeing on more marginal sites, you get into the valley or on some of those soils that just don't have a lot of moisture supply, that we really might be looking at shifting towards ponderosa pine and oak instead of Douglas fir to keep a forest healthy. And then in other situations, we're talking about even moving Douglas fir from further south and lower elevation, because it's very important to plant trees that are from parent trees that are adapted to local conditions. And of course, if the climate is shifting, then we might be looking at the local conditions from further south and moving trees north. So that's a topic for more another day. And of course, another important thing to learn about is how to succeed in reforestation and tree planting. And just kind of looking at the key aspects of that, of course, key thing is to match the species and the type of seedling of any given species to those site conditions. So, is it a shady site? Is it a hot open site, wet site, dry site, high elevation, low? You plant the right tree in the right place. Ordering the seedlings early, normally when we're able to plan ahead, which we'd like to do, we'd order the trees 2 years in advance to ensure that we get the types and species we want. And it usually takes 2 years to grow a standard reforestation seedling. Then, of course, preparing the site is one of the most important things to do, and one of the key reasons for problems is if a site is not well prepared, meaning that maybe it's not very accessible for planting if there's too much debris, and then particularly the competing vegetation. If there's a lot of grass and herb and shrub competition, it's hard for little seedlings to get established. And then handling the seedlings appropriately, getting them fairly soon after they're lifted from the nursery, keeping them cool, not letting them dry out or heat up, and planting them properly. And then continuing to control competing vegetation after you've done good preparation of a site. Over the next few years, you might have to go back and make sure that some of the weeds or aggressive invasive plants aren't taking over and preventing successful establishment. And then looking at animals, and animal damage is another key issue. Of course, a key part of proper handling of your seedlings is the proper planting technique. And many of us have learned the hard way, and from others, that there are many ways to plant them improperly. So if you look at this illustration, starting with planting too deep, actually Douglas fir in particular, but most conifers do not like to have their roots buried too deeply. Then if they're too shallow, they'll dry out. If you get air pockets in the planting hole. One of the most common mistakes is what we call J-rooting, where really we're stuffing the tree roots into a hole that is too shallow, and that has long-term consequences. Trees will often die young, maybe fairly quickly, and even 20, 30 years down the road because of deformed root systems. Compacting the roots, having the roots soiled be too loose. So there's really only one proper way, which is just the right depth, the roots nicely spread, soil nicely packed, etc. So that's really important to have good planting technique. Looking at an example, here's an area that was planted 3 years previous to this slide, and that site did have a broadcast herbicide site preparation to hold the weeds back for the first year. But you can see, of course, other things were growing back, but the trees are getting pretty well established. Here's another site, same age. It had been 3 years since it had been harvested. This landowner had planted it 2 times and still not succeeding in getting good establishment. One thing missing here was there wasn't, a more broadcast site preparation. The weeds don't look that much different from the previous, but they were pretty well established in the first year. And then there's also some issues with soils. This is a much poorer soil than on the previous site. So it can be a more challenging regeneration environment. And you want to know what you're up against in order to plan to take steps to be more successful. And of course, controlling competing vegetation is one of the more important things to ensure good establishment and survival. Sometimes it seems ironic or hard to understand why we have to work so hard when nature planted trees, and still does, over and over again. But a lot of our environments, after we've disturbed them or with harvesting or just, converting it from grass to something else, we often need to control the weeds to get successful establishment. Hand application, ground application of herbicides is a common way to go about that. And if you're not doing that, if you have different conditions that are using manual methods such as cutting with a weed whacker, in this case with blackberries and brush, obviously a lot more labor intensive. And of course, there's all sorts of machines and other mechanical approaches we can use, without chemicals to remove weeds and clear sites, control them around trees. Pretty common, combined method where we are working with grass and establishing trees. We can use a mulch mat, mulch fabric for vegetation control, and then maybe some mowing as well. So there's a lot of different options, but the important thing is that you take stock of what you're up against and do enough to help your trees get established. And a little may help improve survival, but a lot more weed control will ensure really good growth. And there can be a big difference between just getting them to survive versus getting them to grow well. Another big part of this is that if you've done everything else right, but you have some animal damage hazards, deer and elk being a real common one, but I've listed a lot of other critters here, including humans, that can end up causing damage to our trees. And understanding what you're up against and the likelihood of that is really important, and taking some steps, if you can, to either prevent or protect trees from that damage. Here's an example. This landowner had a site that he knew was a little wet for Douglas fir, planted cedar and also ponderosa pine. Our Willamette Valley ponderosa pine is actually pretty tolerant of both wet and dry conditions. Here's a cedar that is 15 years old and has been browsed every year. And it's rather, I've seen this a lot, it's rather shocking that trees first take this kind of damage, but that they also survive. And then right behind him, our 15-year-old ponderosa pine that were not browsed. And so obviously if we could have prevented that kind of damage, that cedar would have been a lot better off. And then species that are resistant to deer browse do a lot better. Methods we use for protection include these mesh tubes that you may have seen, a wide variety of tree protection devices. Over on the right here, we've got what we just call a bud cap. When the deer just want to nibble on that fresh new growth, that cap will protect it for a brief time. So there's some things that we can do to reduce that. And then the situations when you're planting near water, if you have beaver or nutria, there's nothing more heartbreaking than to have 8 or 9-year-old trees that all got off and running, and then in a short period of time the beavers come and chop them all down. If they have lots of trees to deal with, then maybe there's others to take their place, but a lot of times our trees are pretty precious when we've gone to a lot of trouble to plant near streams. And so we may take extraordinary measures such as wire cages to prevent the beaver damage. And there's things that we can do with beaver. A key part of looking at your forest as a whole and kind of the heart of managing established trees, we call it silviculture, managing the forest to achieve our objectives. And so the main things we can do really are add trees by planting or favoring regeneration, and then subtracting them by thinning them out or controlling, which species is there and the spacing. Again, there's another example of a forest that's been thinned several times, is an older forest that has been manipulated. And a key principle to understanding how to manage established trees is managing growing space. And so we can make a really big difference in the health and vigor of each tree and the desired trees that we want to grow by controlling that growing space, thinning out unwanted trees, and just making more space as the stands grow denser over time. Also ensuring, through weed management and also the spacing and thinning, that trees have enough space, light, water, and nutrients. And a key thing to understand for that is that the amount of site resources, being sunlight, water, nutrients, and that growing space, they're fixed. We can't really add more. Except in the case of, if we were to irrigate or fertilize, which we don't commonly do in more extensive forestry, but it can be possible, obviously, in your home landscape. But the site resources are fixed. And a larger tree needs more than a smaller tree. So those are the two basic principles that we use to understand, what's the right amount of tree spacing depending on the size of the trees. And so early on, we can grow a lot of trees in the given amount of space. And then, of course, one large tree later on is going to use just as much and need as much space as all those little trees. And a key thing to understand, too, is that in nature, without intervention, the stands tend to grow towards their biological maximum density. So if you imagine after a fire or after you plant a bunch of trees, that if you just let them go, they're going to grow up, compete, and eventually get to their maximum carrying capacity. And then in order for trees to continue to grow, some trees will have to die. So you end up seeing winners and losers emerging, and the trees that are either genetically better off or just have a better little spot, they'll be the dominants and co-dominants, is what these Ds and CDs stand for. And then the more suppressed trees will eventually fall behind. So you have winners and losers, which is pretty common in the succession of trees that come up after a disturbance. And we use that knowledge with some scientific basis to understand, the different species have different maximum densities. And so when you want to manage these trees, you kind of want to understand that. So just for example, if a stand of trees is on average 10 inches in diameter, we've learned that, the maximum amount of pine is about 360 per acre, and Doug fir is closer to 600, hemlock over 800. And if we want to keep those trees at spacing where they have more space that are not killing each other, then we thin them down or maintain that at lower densities. And we could have twice as many hemlock as we could have pine. So it's really important to understand the characteristics of these species and the kind of growing space they need if you're going to try to manage it. And a really useful way to look at this is this from this diagram, just looking at the overall kind of characteristics of the tree in terms of the amount of live foliage, or crown ratio we call it. How much of the total tree height has green branches on it? And if you look kind of in the middle of this illustration, the trees that have somewhere around 40% to 60% crown ratio are usually pretty stout and vigorous trees that are growing well. They're fairly stable if they were to be exposed by thinning or have to stand up to wind or snow or ice. And this could actually be trees of all the same age, and the only difference is that the ones on the left, the poor vigor trees, are just overcrowded, and then here's this other extreme of a very open grown tree that's very vigorous and large. And I've certainly seen this over my career. So we try to manage stands, if we're going to do that, to maintain more of the stable vigorous trees kind of in the middle ground here. And if you don't do that, so here's a graphic example of what happens when you have an overcrowded stand, and it really illustrates those kind of skinny, low vigor trees. When they're overcrowded, they don't have much crown or much taper and strength. So the ice accumulation caused catastrophic top breakage for most of the trees in this stand that was overcrowded. And then as a comparison, here's a stand that was thinned, and the trees have bigger crowns that are more in the middle of the spectrum in terms of our tree bigger graphic there, but they have better crown ratios. And so these trees suffered a fair amount of branch loss in the ice storm, but they didn't have very much catastrophic loss of their whole tops. So really pretty clear illustration of the strength and stability of trees that are managed more for good crown ratios and good tree vigor. And you can only really do this with thinning or with spacing control. Big difference. Of course, a really common and obvious situation is looking in the understory. I needed a flash on my camera to characterize this stand in the middle of June because the Douglas fir had really turned out the lights, and there's not really anything else growing under them. And oftentimes this isn't the most desirable condition, and it might be headed towards an unstable, overcrowded stand, such as you saw with my other example for the ice damage. This is actually from an experiment. We've done a lot of these kinds of experiments, just looking at how spacing affects tree and forest characteristics. So in the same area that had been thinned more over time, have a very different type of forest, more of an understory, and also just a lot more stout and robust trees with better crowns and better vigor. And of course, this would be a different situation for wildlife habitat and also, aesthetics and diversity. Now, another key aspect of forestry is how we look at our system for managing a stand of trees. Mentioned that our forests are particularly fire-driven in Western Oregon, and a lot of times with those more stand replacement types of events, the fire can kill most of the trees in an area and a whole new group comes up, usually fairly early after the fire, sometimes within 10 years, other times in more sporadic events. But certainly in our management, we often are managing what we call even age stands, where we would have an area that's clear cut and harvested, and most trees are removed, and then we plant and grow up a new cohort, a new generation of trees. We call that even age management, which is very common around the world for managing trees for timber production, particularly. But the other side of that, or the other end of the spectrum, is what we'd call more mixed age or uneven age management, and often with mixed species as well, with different kinds of sunlight and environmental features. And so here's an example of a mixed species stand, from that Hopkins demonstration forest with Douglas fir and cedar and maple all kind of mixed together. And you see a stump in the foreground where we've removed occasional selectively remove trees, and then we need to refill that spot with a young tree and try to keep kind of the same type of forest over the larger area over time by selective management. That's desirable, but it's also very challenging. If you want to learn more about that, you definitely should attend some workshops and field tours to look at different types of management systems, such as even-aged or uneven-aged. Really common situation is when we have aging forests and we want to keep them well spaced and thin them out, but we're not interested or ready to do any kind of a clear cut or larger patch openings, so we continue to thin them and maybe convert to a more selective system over time to make bigger gaps and bring up more trees without clear cutting larger areas. So a lot of different approaches, but this is obviously important to decide on the kind of system that works for you and meets your goals and know how to do it. And of course, with this aspect of adding trees or removing trees, just in terms of how we manage a stand, to remove the trees, once they get bigger than about 6 to 8 inches, we're talking about logging basically. And there's a lot of different ways and machines or hand felling of trees to accomplish that. So in this example, you see one of those harvester processor types where this machine will cut the tree and lay it down and then cut to length at the same time, and then more typical hand felling and a thinning here. And then, of course, getting on trucks in order to reap the benefits. So when you're thinning these trees and you want to make money at the same time that you're managing your stand, or if it's a final harvest and you're just starting over again and you want to optimize your income, obviously loading these valuable logs and delivering them to a market is an important step. I should note that in the Northwest in Oregon, we have some of our highest value timber land, very productive timberland, and our species, Douglas fir, red cedar, and red alder, are the top 3 in value, and more so than any other, most of the other growing regions in the U.S. So our prices for Douglas fir, cedar, and alder now are higher than you'd find for almost any commodity wood species in the world. So it certainly makes it easier to pay for your operation or to make money if you're in it for the timber production. And of course, then the tools and the machines that we use, there's a lot of different options, and woodland owners in particular like to try different things or use more kind of small scale equipment. So if you start here in the lower right and you look at just taking a farm tractor with a farming winch in this case, this is from a class at one of our field tree schools that we do in Clackamas County at Hopkins Demonstration Forest, demonstrating the use of the tractor with a farming winch for thinning young Douglas fir. Most common tool for yarding trees once they've been cut is a rubber-tired grapple skidder or a tracked vehicle to skid logs. But also there are still some professional horse loggers out there that can do it that way. So there's a lot of different ways that we end up, moving the trees and accomplishing our thinning and other operations. And another key aspect, of course, we talk about, understanding trees and managing the forests for our goals and objectives. And, the kind of forests that we want to see, the kind of forests that we want to enjoy for wildlife habitat, for other reasons. But of course, fire protection and prevention, managing our vegetation so that it's less prone to fire, and reducing the fuels is also a key objective in many cases, and increasingly so here in Western Oregon too. And so I know that our other speaker for this program, Amanda, is going to talk more about fire, but obviously understanding how to manage the vegetation and the trees in terms of the fuels and the fire hazards is a really big part of understanding and knowing your forest and how to manage it. This is just an example that if you've got a home or a building, then we really pay attention to the zone right around that building. The most common way that buildings catch on fire is from the embers and the ember showers that the wind blows to the building. And so that's another story about assessing the vulnerability of your buildings and making them resistant to embers. But if you do have vegetation or flammable materials right next to your building, that can also be a big problem. And so we start there with the home ignition zone. But pretty quickly, you're getting out into the woods and you've got vegetation that you're managing, and we have a lot of good knowledge and understanding about how to manage that so that if fire enters that area, it's going to burn less severely, and that it will be defensible, and that firefighters can effectively and safely, access that and defend the home if they need to. And we have a lot of good information about this. I'll share that a little bit later in our fire program that can help you understand, your options for that. And there's increasingly a lot of assistance for that. So speaking of assistance, and in terms of, where you go to keep learning, that's certainly my main role in what the OSU Extension Service is focused on, is providing education in a variety of different ways, such as this program and other ways of learning. There's also many other public sources of assistance, the Oregon Department of Forestry and their stewardship foresters, of course, the soil and water conservation districts, such as the Marion County SWCD, who's provided this venue for me to help you learn, and Natural Resource Conservation Service with the USDA, your Oregon Small Woodlands Association, and also the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, which is funded by timber tax dollars, is in the business of providing a lot of education materials for landowners. American Tree Farm Program is another, and there are other sources. But, at some point, if you want to really get a lot of work done and you need to have a consultant or an agent, then hiring a forester can be an important step. A professional forester that's in the business and in the know, and can be very effective at helping you achieve your objectives, help you with all the rest of it in terms of like hiring a logging contractor, reforestation contractors, vegetation management contractors. Of course, you can be your own forester and hire all these contractors on your own as you learn more and feel confident. And that's really an important part of getting the work done. Nothing like going out and planting a few acres, 300 or 400 trees per acre, to make you realize that maybe hiring someone to do that for 50 cents a tree might not be a bad idea. And how do you find that, and how do you ensure that they do a good job? And then if you really want to learn more about wildlife management, there are consultants that help you with wildlife habitat. And if you have wetlands or working with wetlands or riparian areas, there's a lot of help out there, and you may need good professional help to do the right thing there. And then, of course, a lot of this takes funding and money. And, of course, the most common or often attractive way to fund the management of your forest is the profits from managing the forest. As I mentioned, the timber values are quite high, and you can certainly make more than enough money to pay for managing the forest as well as provide income, especially when you get up to somewhat larger acreages. But even on 5 or 10 acres, the profits from even just from thinnings can easily pay for all the work and more. There are a lot of great grant programs for conservation and restoration, and there's carbon sequestration options nowadays to even sell some of the carbon credits, along with, again, these incentive programs that help favor developing types that are good for conservation and wildlife. Cost share programs such as, helping people with fuels reduction. And then you can even get loans, and there's a bunch of other programs to think about. Tax credits, they come and go, but those can be important ways to get things done. For years, there's been a reforestation tax credit to help you a bit with some of those costs. And so, continuing your learning adventures in forestry and woodland management, I'm here to help, and we want to kind of tune in on what works for you as far as how you like to learn. Workshops, classes, field tours, and of course we provide a lot of research-based printed material or extension publications. And I have a newsletter. If you'd like to get my newsletter, Woodland Notes, and our monthly e-news, I'd like you to contact me and sign up for that. More technical articles as well. Of course, nowadays, and even more than we like, we go to the internet for online classes and online reading materials. So everything I could send you in print is online these days for the most part. So you can read it at your leisure. And of course, then we have interactive online work that you can do, and you can follow the threads of learning with clicking on different links, which can be really fun and also take you deep into the weeds. But there's also good old site visits and one-on-one consultations, which I can do and others can do. with enough time for an appointment. One of my favorite ways to teach and to learn is from getting a group of folks together on some of our field tours and workshops, where you really can look at the real thing and demonstrate techniques, and then do a lot of on-the-spot Q&A and sharing. And again, one-on-one sometimes with field visits is a good way to do it. Another aspect of this is that you can be a member of the woodland owner community. So learning from your fellow woodland owners, there's a great diversity of people with different objectives and outlooks, but often this common appreciation for trees and forests and stewardship. And so it's really enriching and also useful to get together with a lot of different folks and learn from each other, and this community that support itself. And there's also good networking and advice you can get from your fellow woodland owners and land managers. And many folks have lifetimes of experience and are happy to share. So there's a lot of different ways we can learn from each other. So to wrap up and just kind of review, again, it starts with helping you clarify what your goals and objectives are and making plans. And a lot of times I look at this as sort of a circular process, is you may start with some ideas about what your forest ought to look like and what you should do with it. But as you learn more about the forest and how it grows and kind of what the boundaries are, kind of a reality adjustment, you may change your ideas and your goals and objectives. And then, as time goes by, knowing your species, the biology and how they grow and their tolerances, of course, is important to learn over time. And it's going to take time. You should give yourself a lot of leeway that it's going to take time. And in the meantime, when you need help, you can hire professionals until you learn maybe to do more yourself. The basics of being able to map your property and understand what you have and take inventory is pretty important. And then the basics of adding trees, reforestation, and then managing the trees that are established through silviculture and forest management. And then forest health and protection and fire, really obviously huge and increasingly important, and a lot of resources for that. In fact, it reminds me that on March 2nd, we're having the Forest Health in Oregon State of the State conference, and now it's a free conference because it's online. So you might want to look for that and sign up for it, because we're going to get a really good, in 2 different mornings, a good coverage of state of forest health in Oregon. Watersheds, fish and wildlife, there's a whole lot to learn about that, and many of you probably have some high priorities for those things. And I really just scratched this. Obviously, I didn't really talk even much about business and legal issues, but you are in a forest enterprise when you own those trees and you're paying taxes and you're trying to manage them. And then, of course, your options for marketing products and what it takes to maintain roads and access, and how do you effectively, efficiently harvest and market trees and do the logging as best you can and properly to protect the soils and your own goals there. So really important to then know where to get help, and also as you learn what's going to really work for you. So I hope this has been helpful. And lately we're really doing an awful lot online. So our tree school, which we used to do as an in-person event at Clackamas Community College and also other locations around the state, we've had to go back to doing that online, and we've accumulated over 50 different webinars, topics forestry from A to Z. And I'll make sure you can get the links to access those. The webinars are recorded, and there's a lot of good related resources. Our extension fire program has really ramped up, and we've hired new fire specialists around the state. And of course, we all are paying a lot more attention to fire these days after recent events. So we have a great series of webinars and resources on all things about fire before, during, and after. And then another great resource is the Know Your Forest site at knowyourforest.org, that's maintained by actually a partnership, a lot of different entities that are helping with landowner education. So OSU Extension, the Oregon Forest Resource Institute is the primary hub for this Know Your Forest site, but OSU Extension and others are authors of a lot of the content. So these are great resources I just wanted to let you know about, and we'll make sure you get the links to these in your online resources. So with that, I hope that you have paused me from time to time and written down some questions, and keep those so that we can talk about it when we're in class in the evening for a Q&A session on February 16th for this one. So thank you very much.